In the heart of the Horn of Africa, where ancient mountains pierce clouds and plateaus stretch beyond the horizon, a land of kingdoms and warriors has stood for millennia.
Ascending from the
Ethiopia,
fertile
a name
terraces,
that echoes
we
through
discover
corridors of
villages where
time,
life
a
continues
civilization
as
that
it
traces
has
its
for
roots to
centuries.
Solomon and Sheba, a nation that bent the knee to no foreign power. Yet in the 19th century, this proud realm stood fractured, bleeding from wounds both internal and external. Provincial lords carved the empire into feuding territories, each warlord claiming supremacy while the center crumbled. European powers circled like vultures, drawing maps across African soil, parceling out kingdoms as if they were unclaimed wilderness. From the coastal cities to the highland fortresses, whispers of invasion grew louder. The great powers of Europe had divided a continent among themselves, and Ethiopia's ancient independence seemed destined to become another casualty of imperial ambition. But history, in its infinite complexity, does not follow the scripts written by the powerful. Sometimes, from the chaos of a fragmenting world, emerges a figure who reshapes destiny itself. This is the story of such a man, a prince born in the shadow of mountains, a warrior forged in the fires of civil conflict, a visionary who would transform a collection of warring provinces into a unified empire. His name was Menelik, and his legacy would resound across generations, a testament to strategic brilliance, political acumen, and an unwavering determination to preserve his nation's sovereignty. His journey from a child held hostage to the emperor who defeated European colonialism stands as one of history's most remarkable ascensions, a narrative of survival, cunning, and the relentless pursuit of a unified Ethiopia. The year was 1844, when Menelik entered a world already steeped in turbulence. Born Saleh Mariam in the kingdom of Shewa, a southern province of the fractured Ethiopian realm, he arrived as the son of King Haile Melekot, inheriting a legacy of both royal blood and perpetual conflict. Shewa itself occupied a precarious position in the Ethiopian highlands, wealthy from trade routes, strategically positioned between the coast and the interior, yet vulnerable to the ambitions of neighboring warlords and the powerful Emperor Tewodros II, who sought to reunify Ethiopia through conquest and iron will. The infant prince knew nothing of these complexities, but they would shape every moment of his existence. His childhood unfolded in royal courts where intrigue flowed as freely as honey wine, where loyalty shifted with the seasons, and where the survival of kingdoms depended on marriages, alliances, and the ever-present threat of war. Emperor Tewodros II, the man who would dramatically alter young Saleh Mariam's trajectory, represented both Ethiopia's hope and its chaos. A commoner who had risen through military prowess and ruthless determination, Tewodros dreamed of restoring the empire to its ancient glory, of creating a centralized state powerful enough to resist European encroachment. His vision was noble, his methods brutal. Province by province, he crushed resistance, demanding absolute submission from regional lords who had grown accustomed to autonomy. When King Haile Melekot of Shewa died in 1855, the 11-year-old Saleh Mariam inherited a throne he would never occupy. Tewodros moved swiftly, his armies descending upon Shewa like a storm. The young prince faced a choice that was no choice at all, submission or death. Shewa fell, and the boy who would become Menelik II found himself a hostage in Tewodros's court, a political prisoner whose very existence served as insurance against Shewan rebellion. The years of captivity that followed would have broken lesser spirits. Stripped of his kingdom, separated from his people, the young prince lived under constant surveillance in Tewodros's mountain fortress of Magdala. Yet, captivity, for those with the vision to see beyond their chains, can become an education unlike any other. Menelik watched and learned. He observed Tewodros's court with the keen attention of a student who understands that knowledge is the currency of survival. The emperor, despite his suspicious nature, recognized something in the boy's intelligence, potential, perhaps a mirror of his own ambition. Tewodros provided his hostage with education, military training, and exposure to the machinery of imperial power. Menelik studied warfare and statecraft, languages and diplomacy, the delicate art of reading men's intentions behind their words. He witnessed both the strengths of Tewodros' centralizing vision and the catastrophic weaknesses of rule by fear alone. He saw how paranoia could isolate a ruler, how brutality could transform allies into enemies, how even the most powerful empire could crumble when its foundation rested on force rather than legitimacy. But knowledge without opportunity remains merely academic. For years, Menelik bided his time, playing the role of compliant hostage while his mind mapped escape routes and future strategies. He cultivated relationships with guards and courtiers, never appearing too eager, never revealing the depths of his ambition. He watched as Tewodros' grip on power began to slip, as province after province rebelled against the emperor's increasingly erratic rule, as the dream of unity descended into a nightmare of oppression. The turning point came in 1865, when Menelik, now 21 years old, executed an escape so carefully planned that by the time Tewodros realized his prized hostage had vanished, the prince was already beyond reach. Under cover of darkness, aided by sympathizers who had tired of Tewodros' reign, Menelik fled the fortress that had been both his prison and his academy. He rode south toward Shewa, toward the kingdom that was his by birthright, toward a destiny that would eclipse even his captor's ambitions. His return to Shewa marked the beginning of a new chapter, but the homecoming was far from triumphant. The province he reclaimed existed in a state of exhaustion, drained by years of paying tribute to Tewodros, its nobility divided, its coffers depleted. Menelik arrived not as a conquering hero, but as a claimant whose legitimacy would need to be proven through action. He understood that mere royal blood would not secure his position. He needed to demonstrate capability, vision, and the strength to protect his people from the chaos consuming Ethiopia. The young king, who took control of Shewa in 1865, bore little resemblance to the child who had been taken captive a decade earlier. Menelik had transformed captivity into crucible, emerging with a sophisticated understanding of power's mechanisms and a clarity of purpose that would define his reign. His first years as king of Shewa demonstrated a political intelligence far beyond his years. Where other regional lords focused on short-term gains and petty feuds, Menelik played a longer game, one that required patience, strategic alliances, and the careful accumulation of resources. He recognized that Shewa's wealth lay not merely in its agricultural production, but in its position along trade routes connecting the coast to the interior. He negotiated commercial agreements, welcomed traders regardless of their origins, and ensured that caravans traveling through his territory found security and fair treatment. As gold and goods flowed through Shewa, the province's treasury grew, providing Menelik with the financial foundation necessary for his ambitions. But wealth alone could not secure a kingdom in the violent landscape of 19th-century Ethiopia. Military strength remained the ultimate arbiter of power, and Menelik devoted himself to creating an army that could defend his realm and, when necessary, expand it. He studied the weapons and tactics of both traditional Ethiopian warfare and the modern European military systems that were beginning to penetrate the region. Where Tewodros had relied primarily on traditional levies of spear-carrying warriors, Menelik recognized the transformative power of firearms. He established trade relationships with European merchants and arms dealers, exchanging ivory, coffee, and gold for rifles and ammunition. He recruited and trained soldiers not just in courage and loyalty, but in the coordinated use of modern weaponry. His army became a hybrid force, retaining the mobility and knowledge of highland terrain that characterized Ethiopian warriors, while incorporating the disciplined firepower of European-style infantry. As Menelik strengthened Shewa, the empire around him continued its descent into fragmentation. Emperor Tewodros, increasingly isolated and paranoid, made a catastrophic miscalculation in 1867 when he imprisoned British missionaries and diplomats, triggering a military expedition from the world's most powerful empire. The British Expeditionary Force that arrived in 1868 was a demonstration of industrial military might organized, equipped with the latest weapons, and commanded by officers trained in the arts of modern warfare. Tewodros, his authority already crumbling, his army depleted by desertions, chose to make his stand at Magdala, the same fortress where Menelik had spent his captive years. The battle was brief and one-sided. Rather than face capture, Tewodros took his own life, his death marking the end of an era and the beginning of a new struggle for Ethiopia's throne. The power vacuum that followed Tewodros's suicide plunged Ethiopia into a period of renewed chaos. Multiple claimants emerged, each backed by regional armies and noble factions. From this turmoil rose Yohannes IV, a northern lord who possessed both military strength and strategic position. Yohannes claimed the imperial throne and moved to consolidate power, demanding submission from regional rulers, including Menelik. The king of Shewa faced a delicate calculation: resist and risk destruction, or submit and accept subordination. Menelik chose a middle path that revealed his diplomatic sophistication. He acknowledged Yohannes as emperor, paid tribute, and presented himself as a loyal vassal. Yet his submission was conditional and calculated. He retained control over Shewa's internal affairs, continued building his military strength, and never truly surrendered his independence. He attended Yohannes's court when summoned, but maintained his own network of alliances and his own vision for Ethiopia's future. The relationship between Menelik and Yohannes embodied a complex dynamic of cooperation and competition. Both men understood that Ethiopia faced existential threats from European colonialism. The scramble for Africa had intensified, with European powers carving the continent into colonial possessions at a dizzying pace. Egypt pressed from the north, Italy eyed the coastline with imperial ambition, and the Mahdist forces in Sudan threatened from the west. Yohannes and Menelik shared a commitment to Ethiopian independence, yet they differed fundamentally in vision and method. Yohannes represented traditional highland nobility, focused on military confrontation and the preservation of established power structures. Menelik embodied a more modern, pragmatic approach, willing to adopt foreign technologies, flexible in diplomacy, and committed to expansion and development. Their alliance remained functional but tense, each aware that the other harbored greater ambitions. During these years of nominal vassalage, Menelik pursued a careful strategy of expansion and consolidation. He directed his military efforts southward and eastward, into territories that had historically maintained loose connections to the Ethiopian state or existed as independent kingdoms. These campaigns were neither random raids nor purely exploitative conquests. Menelik understood that true power required not just military victories, but lasting integration. He conquered, yes, but then he worked to incorporate new territories into a functioning administrative system. He appointed governors, established trade networks, collected taxes, and gradually built the infrastructure of a modern state. He brought into his realm territories rich in resources, gold, ivory, coffee, and agricultural lands that could support larger populations and armies. Each conquest expanded his tax base, each integration increased his strength relative to other Ethiopian lords. His territorial expansion also served a larger strategic purpose. By extending Shewa's borders, Menelik created buffer zones against both European colonialism and regional rivals. He positioned himself as a ruler capable of delivering what Yohannes could not: sustained growth, administrative efficiency, and a vision of Ethiopia that extended beyond the traditional highland core. When European powers began signing treaties with local rulers, carving out spheres of influence and protectorates, Menelik engaged with them on his own terms. He negotiated, signed treaties when advantageous, and ignored provisions when they threatened his interests. He purchased weapons from Italian, French, and British merchants, playing European rivalries against each other to secure better terms and maintain his independence. The strategic landscape shifted dramatically in the late 1880s as European imperial ambitions crystallized into concrete territorial claims. Italy, a latecomer to the colonial enterprise and eager to establish its own African empire, focused its attention on the Horn of Africa. The Italians had established a foothold in Massawa on the Red Sea coast and began pushing into the highlands, signing treaties with local rulers and gradually constructing the colony they would name Eritrea. For Menelik, Italian expansion represented both threat and opportunity. He maintained diplomatic relations with Italy, recognizing that European powers commanded resources and technologies Ethiopia needed. Yet he never harbored illusions about Italian intentions. Every treaty, every agreement, every exchange was calculated with the understanding that Italy ultimately sought to reduce Ethiopia to colonial status, to add another jewel to Europe's African crown. The death of Emperor Yohannes IV in 1889, killed in battle against Mahdist forces from Sudan, presented Menelik with the opportunity he had patiently awaited. The throne stood empty, and Menelik moved decisively. He proclaimed himself Emperor Menelik II, invoking his descent from the legendary King Menelik I, son of Solomon and Sheba, thereby connecting his rule to Ethiopia's most ancient and revered lineages. His claim to the imperial throne was not universally accepted, nor the nobles who had served. Yohannes resisted subordination to a southern ruler, and rival claimants emerged from various provinces. But Menelik had spent decades preparing for this moment. His treasury was full, his army was strong and well-equipped, his administrative apparatus was functional, and his reputation as a capable ruler preceded him. He combined military pressure with diplomatic outreach, offering positions and privileges to nobles who submitted while systematically defeating those who resisted. Province by province, through a combination of force and persuasion, Menelik brought the fractured empire under his authority. As emperor, Menelik pursued an ambitious program of modernization and centralization. He established his capital at Addis Ababa, a new city founded in the highlands, symbolizing a fresh start and a break from traditional power centers. From Addis Ababa, he began constructing the apparatus of a modern state. He created a more regularized tax system, established courts and administrative procedures, and began the long process of transforming Ethiopia from a collection of semi-autonomous provinces into an integrated empire. He welcomed foreign advisors and technicians, Europeans, Armenians, Greeks, Arabs, anyone who possessed skills Ethiopia needed. He initiated infrastructure projects, including the planning for a railroad that would connect Addis Ababa to the coast, recognizing that economic development required transportation networks. He granted concessions for telegraph lines, understanding that communication speed was crucial for governing a vast territory. He encouraged education, bringing in teachers and establishing schools that would produce a literate administrative class capable of managing a modern state. Yet even as Menelik worked to modernize his empire internally, the Italian threat grew more pressing. Italy had signed the Treaty of Wuchale with Menelik in 1889, an agreement that both sides interpreted differently. The Amharic version of the treaty stated that Ethiopia could use Italy for diplomatic communications with other European powers if it chose to. The Italian version, however, claimed that Ethiopia must conduct all foreign relations through Italy, effectively making Ethiopia an Italian protectorate. This deliberate mistranslation was not mere clerical error, but calculated deception, designed to give Italy legal justification for claiming Ethiopia as part of its colonial empire. When Menelik discovered the discrepancy, he denounced the treaty and rejected any claim of Italian sovereignty over Ethiopia. The Italians, already having announced to other European powers that Ethiopia was under their protection, faced a choice: withdraw their claim and lose face, or enforce it through military conquest. Italy chose conquest. The Italian government, driven by nationalist fervor and colonial ambition, began preparing for war. They reinforced their garrison in Eritrea, recruited additional troops from Italy, and enlisted thousands of Askari soldiers from their African colonies. The Italian press promoted the coming campaign as a civilizing mission, a necessary step in bringing order and progress to Africa. European observers generally expected an Italian victory after all. Italy was a European power with modern weapons, trained officers, and the backing of industrial civilization, while Ethiopia was perceived as a medieval African kingdom, backward and primitive. Few Europeans imagined that Ethiopian forces could stand against European military power. History, they believed, was on Italy's side. But history, as Menelik understood, is written by those who prepare most thoroughly. As Italian preparations advanced, Menelik mobilized Ethiopia for total war. He sent messengers throughout the empire, calling upon provincial lords and regional nobles to fulfill their obligations to the crown. He invoked Ethiopian patriotism, Christian solidarity, and the sacred duty to defend the homeland from foreign invasion. The response was overwhelming. From every province, armies assembled warriors carrying rifles that Menelik had spent years acquiring, traditional fighters with spears and shields, cavalry units from the plains, highland infantry accustomed to mountain warfare. Women supported the war effort, carrying supplies, preparing food, and in some cases, fighting alongside men. Menelik assembled an army that numbered in the tens of thousands, a force unified by common purpose and led by experienced commanders who knew the terrain intimately. The campaign that would decide Ethiopia's fate began in earnest in 1895 as Italian forces under General Oreste Baratieri advanced from Eritrea into Tigrayan territory in northern Ethiopia. The Italians achieved initial successes, capturing forts and towns. Their modern artillery and organized infantry overwhelming local resistance. European newspapers reported these victories as confirmation of Italian military superiority, predicting swift conquest. But Baratieri's advance was stretching Italian supply lines ever longer, pulling his forces deeper into mountainous terrain where European military advantages diminished. Menelik, rather than rushing to confront the Italians, continued his methodical mobilization. He understood that time favored Ethiopia. Each passing week allowed more provincial levies to reach his gathering army, while Italian forces grew more isolated and vulnerable. By late 1895, Menelik began moving north with his assembled forces, a massive army that represented the largest military mobilization in Ethiopian history. The logistics of moving tens of thousands of soldiers through mountainous terrain, ensuring they remained fed and equipped, represented an organizational achievement that shattered European assumptions about African military capabilities. Menelik's army included contingents from every region of the empire, commanded by nobles and generals who had proven themselves in decades of warfare. Among them was Empress Taitu Betul, Menelik's wife, who played a crucial role not just in logistics and morale, but in strategic councils. Her political acumen and fierce determination to preserve Ethiopian independence matched her husband's, and her presence symbolized the totality of Ethiopia's commitment to resistance. As the two armies converged, General Baratieri found himself in an increasingly precarious position. His supply situation was deteriorating. His troops were exhausted from constant campaigning in difficult terrain, and intelligence reports indicated that Ethiopian forces far outnumbered his own army. Baratieri faced intense pressure from Rome to achieve decisive victory. The Italian government had invested enormous resources and political capital in the campaign and demanded results. Yet the cautious general recognized the dangers of engaging a numerically superior enemy in unfamiliar terrain. He established a defensive position near the town of Adwa, hoping that Menelik might attack his fortified camp, allowing Italian firepower to devastate the Ethiopian assault. For weeks, the two armies maneuvered, each seeking advantage, while Baratieri's situation grew increasingly desperate. In late February 1896, facing supply shortages and pressure from his subordinate commanders who accused him of cowardice, Baratieri made a fateful decision. He would attack the Ethiopian positions before dawn, hoping to achieve surprise and break through Menelik's lines before the full Ethiopian army could respond. On the night of February 29th, Italian forces began a night march, intended to position them for a coordinated assault at first light, but night movements in mountainous terrain proved far more difficult than planned. Italian brigades became separated in the darkness, lost their way on confusing mountain paths, and arrived at their assault positions exhausted, disorganized, and hours behind schedule. What was meant to be a coordinated surprise attack devolved into a series of isolated advances by confused units stumbling into prepared Ethiopian positions. The Battle of Adwa began at dawn on March 1st, 1896, and quickly turned into a catastrophe for Italian arms. Rather than achieving surprise, the Italians found themselves facing an Ethiopian army that was alert, positioned, and vastly superior in numbers. Menelik's forces, numbering between 80,000 and 100,000 warriors, crashed into the separated Italian brigades with overwhelming force. Ethiopian soldiers, fighting to preserve their nation's independence on their own soil, demonstrated a ferocity and determination that shattered Italian formations. The Italians, despite their modern rifles and artillery, found themselves surrounded and overwhelmed. Ethiopian cavalry swept around Italian flanks, cutting off retreat routes. Infantry assaults, wave after wave of warriors willing to absorb casualties to close with the enemy, broke through Italian defensive positions. Artillery crews were overrun before they could effectively deploy their weapons. Italian askari units, recruited from colonial territories, faced Ethiopian appeals to abandon their colonial masters and join the fight for African freedom. By midday, the Italian position was hopeless. Entire brigades had been destroyed or captured. General Baratieri, watching his army disintegrate, ordered a general retreat that quickly became a rout. Italian soldiers fled in panic, abandoning weapons and equipment, desperately trying to escape the pursuing Ethiopian forces. The casualties were staggering: approximately 7,000 Italian soldiers killed, wounded, or captured, including nearly half of the Italian officers. Thousands more askari troops were killed or taken prisoner. The Italians lost their artillery, their supply trains, everything they could not carry in panicked flight. Menelik's forces pursued the broken Italian army for miles, capturing stragglers and ensuring that the defeat was total and undeniable. The Battle of Adwa stands as one of history's decisive encounters, a moment when the expected order of the world was dramatically overturned. For the first time in the colonial era, an African army had decisively defeated a European power in open battle. The implications echoed far beyond Ethiopia's borders. News of the Italian catastrophe sent shockwaves through Europe, shattering assumptions about European military invincibility and African military capability. In Italy, the government fell, replaced by leaders who sued for peace. In Africa and throughout the colonized world, Adwa became a symbol of resistance, proof that European imperialism was not inevitable, that colonialism could be defeated. For Ethiopia, victory secured the independence that made it unique among African nations. While the rest of the continent fell under colonial rule, Ethiopia remained sovereign, a beacon of African self-determination. In the aftermath of Adwa, Menelik negotiated from a position of strength. The Treaty of Addis Ababa, signed in October 1896, nullified the Treaty of Wuchale and forced Italy to recognize Ethiopia's absolute independence and territorial integrity. The Italian government paid an indemnity, returned captured weapons, and withdrew its colonial ambitions toward Ethiopia. For Menelik, diplomatic victory complemented military triumph. He had achieved what seemed impossible. He had defended Ethiopia's sovereignty against European colonialism at the very height of the imperial age. When European powers were carving up the entire African continent, the emperor, who had once been a hostage, had become the architect of one of history's greatest underdog victories. Yet Menelik understood that military victory alone could not ensure lasting independence. The years following Adwa saw the emperor redouble his efforts at state-building and modernization. He recognized that Ethiopia's survival in a world dominated by industrialized powers required not just military strength, but economic development, infrastructure, and integration into global commerce on favorable terms. He pursued his railroad project, eventually connecting Addis Ababa to Djibouti on the coast, opening Ethiopia to international trade while maintaining control over the vital link to the sea. He established a national postal system, modernized the imperial administration, and created institutions that would outlast his reign. He negotiated treaties with multiple European powers, playing them against each other to preserve Ethiopian independence while accessing technology and trade. France, Britain, Italy, he maintained relations with all, never allowing any single power to dominate Ethiopian foreign policy. Internally, Menelik worked to consolidate the territorial gains that had created a vastly expanded Ethiopian empire. The lands he had conquered in the south and east during his years as king of Shewa and in the early years of his imperial reign were gradually integrated into the administrative structure of the empire. This expansion was not without controversy or cost. Many of the incorporated territories had their own cultures, languages, and political traditions. Integration often meant subordination, the imposition of Amharic language and culture, the displacement of local elites, and the extraction of resources to support the imperial center. The empire Menelik forged was diverse and vast, but unity came at the price of local autonomy and, in many cases, local resentment. The tensions created by this expansion would echo through Ethiopian history for generations, complicating the legacy of the emperor who unified the nation. Menelik's later years brought challenges both personal and political. His health began to decline in the early 1900s, with a series of strokes limiting his ability to govern actively. As his physical capacity diminished, questions of succession and the stability of the empire he had built grew pressing. Various nobles and family members maneuvered for advantage, hoping to position themselves for power after the emperor's death. The centralized state Menelik had constructed remained fragile, dependent on his personal authority and the loyalty he commanded. Without his guiding hand, would the empire fragment again into competing provinces? Would foreign powers exploit Ethiopian weakness to renew their colonial ambitions? These questions hung over the final years of Menelik's reign. Despite physical decline, Menelik continued to work for Ethiopia's advancement until the end. He remained engaged in diplomatic correspondence, infrastructure projects, and administrative reforms, even as his body failed him. He understood that his life's work, the unified, independent Ethiopia he had fought to create, required constant attention and vigilance. He worked to establish institutions that could function beyond his lifetime, to create systems that did not depend solely on the charisma and capability of a single ruler. His efforts bore fruit when he finally died in December 1913. After years of declining health, Ethiopia did not descend into immediate chaos. His grandson, Lige Iyasu, initially succeeded him, though political instability would lead to his deposition and the eventual rise of Empress Zuditu and Ras Tafari, the future Emperor Haile Selassie, who would themselves shape Ethiopia's 20th century trajectory. The legacy Menelik left behind was complex and multifaceted. He is remembered as the emperor who defeated colonialism, who preserved Ethiopian independence when the rest of Africa fell under European rule. This achievement alone ensures his place among history's most significant figures. The Battle of Adwa remains a defining moment in African history, celebrated not just in Ethiopia, but throughout the African diaspora as proof of African capability and resistance. Menelik's strategic brilliance, his political acumen, his ability to modernize while preserving tradition, all contributed to this historic victory. He demonstrated that African leaders could master modern military technology, could organize logistics on a massive scale, and could outmaneuver European powers through diplomacy and warfare alike. Yet Menelik's legacy extends beyond the battlefield. He was a state builder who transformed Ethiopia from a collection of feuding provinces into a centralized empire with the administrative structures of a modern nation. He laid the groundwork for institutions, postal service, telegraph communications, railroad infrastructure, formal bureaucracy that connected Ethiopia to the modern world while preserving its sovereignty. He negotiated the treacherous currents of international diplomacy with skill, maintaining Ethiopia's independence while engaging with global powers. He understood that isolation was not viable in the modern age, that Ethiopia needed to trade, to communicate, to participate in international affairs while jealously guarding its autonomy. At the same time, Menelik's legacy includes the costs of empire building. The territories he conquered and incorporated into Ethiopia were not empty lands awaiting benevolent administration. They were kingdoms and societies with their own histories and identities. Integration meant subordination for many, the imposition of a new political order that privileged Amharic culture and the highland nobility. The empire he created was diverse, encompassing dozens of ethnic groups and languages, but this diversity existed within a hierarchical structure that generated tensions and resentments. Modern Ethiopian history has been shaped by these tensions, by questions of federalism and ethnic autonomy, by debates over whether Ethiopia should be a unitary state or a federation of peoples. Menelik's conquests created the territorial foundation of modern Ethiopia, but they also bequeathed complex challenges regarding identity, governance, and justice. Evaluating Menelik requires holding multiple truths simultaneously. He was both liberator and conqueror, modernizer and traditional ruler, a defender of independence who built an empire. His accomplishments, defeating Italy, preserving Ethiopian sovereignty, building state institutions, were monumental. His methods, military conquest, centralization, the subordination of diverse peoples to a unified state were typical of empire builders throughout history, but nonetheless had real costs for those who found themselves incorporated against their will. To understand Menelik is to grapple with these complexities, to recognize that historical figures contain multitudes, that the same person can be hero to some and oppressor to others. What remains indisputable is Menelik's extraordinary journey from hostage prince to conquering emperor. His life story reads like legend: the boy held captive who observed his captor's mistakes and learned from them, the young king who patiently built power while nominally serving a rival, the emperor who unified a fractured realm and defeated European colonialism. Each phase of his life demonstrated qualities that explain his ultimate success. He possessed strategic patience, willing to wait years or decades for opportunities while never losing sight of his goals. He combined military prowess with diplomatic skill, understanding that power flows from both the barrel of a gun and the negotiating table. He embraced innovation and modernization while maintaining the cultural and religious legitimacy that bound his people together. He was ruthless when necessary, but pragmatic enough to prefer negotiation to unnecessary conflict. The Ethiopia that Menelik left behind in 1913 was fundamentally different from the fractured realm of his youth. It was unified, independent, and recognized by European powers as a sovereign state. It possessed the infrastructure and institutions of a modern nation. It had proven on the battlefield that African armies could defeat European forces, that colonialism was not destiny, but could be resisted and overcome. The sense of pride and identity that Adwa instilled in Ethiopians resonates to this day. The victory remains a cornerstone of Ethiopian national consciousness, celebrated annually, studied in schools, remembered as the moment when Ethiopia stood against the world and prevailed. Beyond Ethiopia's borders, Menelik's legacy resonates throughout Africa and the African diaspora. Adwa became a symbol of anti-colonial resistance, inspiring independence movements across the continent. When African nations began achieving independence in the mid-20th century, many looked back to Ethiopia's example, to the proof that African nations could govern themselves, could resist European domination, could claim their place in the world as equals rather than subjects. The Pan-African movement, which sought unity and dignity for people of African descent worldwide, held Ethiopia as evidence that the narratives of African inferiority propagated by colonial powers were lies. W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, and countless other leaders of African liberation movements cited Ethiopia's independence and Adwa's victory as inspiration and validation. Menelik's diplomatic legacy also deserves recognition. He navigated the treacherous waters of great power politics with remarkable skill, maintaining Ethiopia's independence while never becoming isolated. He understood that in a world dominated by European powers, Ethiopia needed relationships with those powers while never surrendering sovereignty. He played European nations against each other, exploited their rivalries, and ensured that no single power could dominate Ethiopian affairs. This diplomatic balancing act required constant attention and sophisticated understanding of European politics. That Ethiopia maintained its independence through the entire colonial period owed much to Menelik's establishment of diplomatic precedents and relationships that his successors could build upon. The emperor's commitment to modernization, while sometimes contradictory and incomplete, nevertheless set Ethiopia on a path toward engagement with the modern world. The infrastructure he built, railroads, telegraph lines, postal services connected Ethiopia's interior to global networks of trade and communication. The administrative reforms he implemented created bureaucratic structures that, however imperfect, represented movement toward rationalized governance. His willingness to employ foreign advisors and experts, to purchase modern weapons and technology, to send students abroad for education, all reflected an understanding that preserving independence required adapting to changed circumstances. Unlike leaders who rejected all foreign influence and all modernization, Menelik distinguished between sovereignty and isolation, understanding that Ethiopia could maintain its independence while selectively adopting beneficial innovations. Yet for all his achievements, Menelik was also a man of his time, shaped by the values and assumptions of 19th-century monarchy. He ruled as an absolute emperor, tolerating no fundamental challenges to his authority. The modernization he pursued was top-down, directed by the state rather than emerging from broader social transformation. The empire he built remained hierarchical, with power concentrated in the emperor and the nobility, with ordinary Ethiopians having no meaningful voice in governance. While he built institutions, he did not create democratic structures or mechanisms for popular participation. Ethiopia under Menelik was an independent empire, but it was still an empire, with all that implied about power, hierarchy, and the rights of subject peoples. His health struggles in his final years revealed the fragility of a system dependent on personal rule. Despite his institution-building efforts, Ethiopian governance remained centered on the emperor's person. When Menelik suffered his strokes and could no longer actively govern, the state struggled. Succession disputes, noble rivalries, and political instability plagued Ethiopia in the years following his death. The stability he had imposed through strength of personality and political skill proved difficult to maintain through institutional structures alone. This fragility would continue to challenge Ethiopia through the 20th century, as questions of governance, legitimacy, and political participation remained unresolved. Standing in Addis Ababa today, one can see Menelik's legacy everywhere. The city he founded as his capital has grown into a metropolis, the seat of the African Union, a symbol of African self-determination and Pan-African unity. Monuments to Menelik dot the landscape, reminding Ethiopians and visitors alike of the emperor who defended independence. The national consciousness he helped forge remains strong. Ethiopians take profound pride in being the African nation that defeated colonialism, that maintained sovereignty when others fell. The complex, diverse nation he unified continues to grapple with questions of identity and governance, but it remains unified, independent, and proud. In the broader sweep of African history, Menelik stands as a pivotal figure. He proved that African leaders could master modern statecraft, could defeat European military power, could build nations capable of surviving in a hostile international environment. He demonstrated that colonialism was not inevitable, that African independence was possible and could be defended. While his methods and the structure of the state he built can and should be critically examined, his fundamental achievement, preserving Ethiopian sovereignty during the age of imperialism, remains monumental. In an era when European powers carved up an entire continent, when African kingdoms fell one after another to colonial conquest, one nation stood firm. That nation was Ethiopia, and the man who led it to victory was Menelik II. His story resonates because it speaks to universal themes: the triumph of strategic thinking over brute force, the power of unity over division, the possibility of resistance against overwhelming odds. It challenges narratives of inevitable European dominance and African subordination. It demonstrates that history is made by individuals who refuse to accept the limitations others place upon them, who see possibilities where others see only constraints, who transform personal ambition into collective achievement. From hostage prince to conquering emperor, from regional king to defeater of colonialism, Menelik's journey embodies the complexity and possibility of human agency in shaping historical outcomes. His legacy, contested and complex as it may be, ensures that he will be remembered as long as people study African history, celebrate resistance to imperialism, and honor those who shaped nations.